Good afternoon and welcome to our first in the series of spring seminars. Today we're going to focus on the arable sector, and on Thursday afternoon we're going to focus on the livestock sector. The way we've decided to run this is we've pre-prepared a series of short and informative videos that we're going to share with you, and then we're going to have the ability for all of you to submit questions to our panel. So we've got 3 experts standing by who will be available to address those questions. Please don't try do anything verbal or with your videos. Those have been disabled, which perhaps is a good thing, so there's no comments about my accent. But you will be able to ask any questions. So if we just have a look towards the bottom of your screen, there'll be a tab which says Q&A. If you click on that, you can then type any questions, and those questions will come to myself and the panel. So hopefully that's all clear, and you're ready for what should be an informative, interesting, and hopefully fun afternoon. As I said, questions can be submitted throughout the presentation, but I'll keep reminding you during the course of the afternoon. And then towards the end of the week, we will publish this presentation online so you can watch it again, or if there's an element you want to review or remind yourself about. Okay. The first suite of videos, which we'll begin with shortly, will be by Phil Dunn, who's going to give us a summary of the potato industry and the challenges and opportunities caused by Brexit and, of course, the transition period. That will be followed by a video by Bradley Hearn, who will address the same issues, but to do with the arable sector. So could we please have the first 2 videos? Thank you.
Hello and welcome to my potato sector update, incorporating the issues arising around Brexit and the new agricultural bill. My name is Philip Dunn. I'm a partner in the business consultancy department of Brown&Co, working out of the Brig office. In my opinion, specialism and attention to detail are the key components that result in success in most businesses. There is no longer the place for the generalist, the jack of all trades. To be at the top of the game, you need to be extremely focused. And this is almost impossible to do with the distraction that comes with trying to do too many things at one time. Potato production is the prime example of this. The sector is and always has been a high risk one, with high capital employed, with potentially big rewards for those that get it right, or tragic consequences for those that don't. Numbers of producers are falling in the UK. In fact, since 1960, it has dropped from around 70,000 growers to now approximately 1,700. Over the same period, the area grown has halved, but the average area grown per producer has obviously risen significantly. Within the potato sector, there is further specialisation into markets such as pre-pack, processed, seed, organic and bag trades. Over time, there has been a steady move towards contracted potatoes as opposed to free buy. Provisional data for Harvest 20 shows that approximately 65% of pre-pack potatoes are now contracted to a customer, with this figure even higher in the processing sector at around 95%. Like most agricultural commodities, the fortunes of any one year are ultimately driven by supply and demand within the season. But these are exaggerated by the growers' production skills and marketing prowess. It is quite normal in the potato sector to see a massive range in net margin, from the top 25% to the bottom 25%, and hence the need for specialism and attention to detail mentioned earlier. The supply situation is majorly influenced by the weather in any particular season, despite measures such as irrigation, which is actually now available to nearly 60% of UK production. Supply is obviously further governed by the annual planted area, which at the current time is around 120,000 hectares, in a steady long-term decline, but with increasing average annual yields. The UK supply is then buffered with import and export volumes, the majority of this trade being with EU for ware potatoes, albeit a minor element of the overall production at about 3 to 5% depending on the individual year. In the seed sector, there is proportionately more cross-border trade, but a much higher percentage is traded outside of the EU. Looking at demand, the UK per capita demand is relatively static at around 103 kilos per head per annum. However, there are long-term dynamics at play here, with the changing eating habits, a move towards processed product, and short-term influences such as the COVID-19 pandemic in the last 12 months, which has temporarily fractured many of these established supply chains, causing chaos in the marketplace. Likewise, the potential impact of Brexit and the new agricultural bill, which are discussed in more detail later. Essentially, UK potatoes are a domestic product with a high bulk volume, low price value, whilst in their raw state, making movements over long distances uneconomic, and in the majority of situations, except in some very specialised sectors, such as seed or early potatoes, and as dehydrated or part processed product, it's difficult to make it add up. So, looking towards the impact of Brexit on the UK potato sector. Firstly, the majority of producers must be relieved by the final agreement to have tariff-free, non-quoted access, freedom of trade for the majority of agricultural products in the UK. This will enable a continuation of the current position as regards potatoes travelling to and from the UK, with only the addition of certain paperwork trails, such as origin, residual chemical levels and phytosanitary status. Most of this paperwork is already required for seed exports and when trading with non-EU exporting countries from the UK anyway. The only major and as yet unresolved issue is that around seed exports to the EU, post January the 1st, where, unlike most other produce, there is currently a blanket ban on imports into the EU, irrespective of any tariff or quota. This has obviously caused great concern amongst seed exporters, specifically those marketing varieties with a specific use for planting in a demand in the EU itself. It is believed that this issue seems to have been overlooked by the Brexit trade talks, but hopefully some form of resolution will be forthcoming and is subject to ongoing negotiations. This problem is greatest in Scotland, where most of the exported seed is grown, but it applies to English seed exporters as well. The resolution would seem more sensible due to the fact that actually some seed comes in from the EU into the UK for multiplication, for specifically exporting back out to the EU again. All other issues around trading overseas remain the same, such as access to ports, container availability, credit insurance, the need to hedge currencies, the nightmare of long distance rejections. In terms of volumes, 70% of our seed exports are actually non-EU, namely Egypt. But looking positively, other new trading partners may develop over time. The potato crop does have a high labour requirement. Much of this is low value work, recently undertaken by migrant labour, which may prove more difficult to source in the post-Brexit world. Some of this labour requirement could hopefully be reduced by the introduction of more technology into grading and sorting, where most of the labour is employed. Hopefully, with grant funding being made available from autumn 21 via the new Farming and Investment Fund or the Innovation Programme, the sector will be able to take advantage of this. In a similar funding programme, there may be opportunities to get funding for better water resource management, i.e. reservoirs and irrigation. These are all key components of the grant funding aspects of the new agricultural bill. Moving on to the impact on the potato sector as a consequence of the Agricultural Bill 2020. Obviously, the loss of basic payment monies will be felt from this year onwards. Adding to this the long-term rotational requirements of potatoes, i.e. grow 1 year in 8, this will inevitably mean that these producers will suffer additional area payment losses on their non-potato component areas in the rotation. The current BPS rate of circa £230 a hectare is a lesser part of the overall output per hectare with potatoes than with combinable crops. However, where land area is licensed in for the growing of the crop, quite a large proportion of it is grown this way, the sum of the licence fee plus the area payment monies forms the total return to the landowner. Changes in this total sum may give rise to some debate. Contrary against this, the increased availability of land put to potato growers as non-growers seek alternatives to less profitable crops could help reverse this situation and provide more land and hence take the price pressure off the potato licensee. Looking at the increasing environmental pressures, and particularly the growing interest in carbon market and the carbon neutrality, there could be a hurdle to overcome in the potato sector. Potatoes are not generally grown in what could be seen as a very environmentally friendly way, with most involving exposed soils over winter, heavy cultivations, intensive seedbed preparations, and the high use of preventative chemicals, the heavy requirement for irrigation water wherever possible to ensure yield and skin finish. However, the industry has already overcome pressure with chemical withdrawals such as CIPC, Monsarin, plus the push towards physical crop topping as opposed to chemical horn destruction. Production practices will have to evolve to accommodate these new and ever-increasing requirements, undoubtedly giving rise to extra cost without necessarily seeing increased prices. But like other crops, maintaining margin will have to come from either increased expertise in marketing, i.e. increasing the price for the commodity, increased yields, or lower cost of production, or a combination of these wherever possible. Looking forwards, potatoes are a staple component and part of a balanced diet of the UK population. They're a flexible food, well positioned to the changing dietary trends, i.e. such as fast food and snacking. The demand should remain strong. The sector has always fought battles for market share with some of the more trendier foods such as pasta and rice. However, continued product innovation and increased marketing will be required to maintain shelf space and market share. Our climate is well suited to potato production, albeit the stress of weather patterns continue to be challenging. The barriers to entry are high, therefore hopefully creating a relatively stable supply position. The product doesn't travel well, therefore import-export threats are relatively low pre or post-Brexit. So in summary, my key messages for the potato sector are: this is a highly specialised sector. Treat it as such. It is very easy to get it wrong and lose lots of money. only be in this sector if you have all the right assets and a strong commitment to potato growing. Focus beyond the farm gate. Marketing is key to prosperity. It's such a highly price volatile commodity. There are so many opportunities for product differentiation and hence price variation. Always grow for a target market, whether you contract or not. Finally, undertake sensible but acceptable levels of investment in the production of potatoes, such as irrigation, storage, and technical knowledge. They'll all be required to keep ahead of the rest. So that's the end of the short summary of my UK potato production and the thoughts and issues around Brexit, subsidy change, and the sustainability of the sector into the future. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Bradley Hearn. I'm an agricultural business consultant based in our Kings Lynn office. I'm going to provide an update on the arable sector. Harvest 2020 on the whole was very poor. UK wheat production is estimated at 10 million tonnes, which is 37.5% down on harvest 2019. The UK 5-year average for wheat production has been 15.1 million tonnes. Early indications would suggest that harvest 2021 will be below this, particularly with the difficult autumn drilling season and wet conditions we've experienced since then. The wheat market has increased significantly since harvest. Harvest movement was around £150 a tonne. We're now seeing prices in the region of £200 a tonne. The 2020 winter Aussie rape harvest was also very poor. This stemmed from the challenging establishment conditions, which was then followed by relentless flea beetle pressure. Those farms that were able to establish a crop were then hit by extreme wet, then dry conditions in spring 2020. Oilseed rape yields varied greatly, with some crop failure, and some of the poorest reported yields were half a tonne a hectare. The UK average yield was between 2.5 and 3 tonnes a hectare, which is down on the 5-year average of 3.5 tonnes a hectare. The oilseed rape area for harvest 2021 again is down, as many businesses have chosen not to establish due to the risk of crop failure and the significant costs required at the front end of the growing season. The 2021 winter wheat area is up on last year. We cannot measure the impact of the wet conditions at this stage. Wheat crops are about to go into their key growth stages, at which point we will have a better idea of where yields are going to be. The AHDB are reporting that EU and US wheat production is expected to rebound after harvest 2020, which could put pressure on prices for new crop. May 2021 wheat futures are £200 to £210 a tonne, and November 2021 new crop price is £165 a tonne. It may be worthwhile at this stage looking at entering some early crop sales to protect your position. I'm now going to provide an update on Brexit and the implications this has had or potentially going to have in the future on the arable sector. As I'm sure many of you are aware, Boris has managed to negotiate a welcome trade deal with the EU, which is good news for all farming sectors. We are now looking at a tariff-free environment. One market in the arable sector that we were particularly concerned about is the barley market, where the UK is a net exporter. This trade deal will invigorate some confidence back into UK farming and provide some security in crop production. We do anticipate that there could be border checks and additional paperwork which are likely to push the price of exported goods up. Inevitably, there is going to be an increase in trade complexity, and going forwards the UK and EU now need to work out the best way to minimise disruption and ensure trade routes are kept open. The Christmas period and the disruption at Calais and Dover really highlighted the importance of managing trade routes and borders. Next, I just would like to touch on the agricultural transition period and again the implications this is going to have on the arable sector. This slide demonstrates the impact of BPS reductions for a 1,000-acre farm. The 2020 BPS receipt would be in the region of 93,000, and it is confirmed that all payments will at least be halved by 2024 as we move into the transition period. These reductions are not only going to impact profitability within the industry, but also cash flow. A proportion of this BPS reduction will be mitigated by ELMs, subject to individual businesses entering such schemes. ELMs are expected to be launched in 2024. However, this is not going to fill the entirety of the BPS hole. Our advice is that businesses now need to look at their cost structures and systems to work out the best strategy for how they are going to manage this transition period. There is a lot of talk in the industry regarding regenerative agriculture, with the focus being on soil health, improving and restoring soil structure, rebuilding soil organic matter and biology. The combination of organic matter and microorganisms will improve the soil's ability to retain water and store carbon. Ultimately, as a sector, we need to explore new systems that will work for individual businesses. We need to be addressing the serious challenges of how we're going to survive in a less supported industry. Whether that be striving for increased efficiencies, creating economies of scale, reducing our costs, or possibly descaling or looking at collaboration. We need to have a greater focus on net margin, and as part of that, each business needs to understand their own route to delivering a sustainable, positive net margin. As with any changes made within businesses, whether that be min-till, no-till, a regenerative farming system, or integrating new crops into the rotation, the decision needs to be made with a long-term objective and with the overall goal of making the new system successful. The decision to change needs to be driven by the desire for the success of the change within your business, not necessarily driven by costs at the initial stage. Ultimately, once the system is successful, cost reductions will follow. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Phil and Bradley. Crikey, how interesting, just on the potato front, just a few points that I've picked up. A reduction of producers from 70,000 to 1,700. Isn't that just incredible? Areas halved, but no potato shortages. It signifies an industry that has embraced technology and specialization. And as Phil said, one where the risks are high. Interesting what's going to happen, and perhaps we can have time a bit later about license fees, perhaps more land becoming available, but BPS reducing. How is sort of landowners going to deal with that? And the environmental challenges of producing potatoes and perhaps all root crops when you're moving sort of tons of soil. And Phil, I thought quite interesting at the end, the point that you mentioned, we either need to increase value, and that's marketing or yield, or reduce costs, or combinations of both. And I bet we can apply that same principle to other industries as well. Bradley, thank you for reminding us of what an awful year it was last year. But let's look forward. Some more positive signs, yes, for next year. Good news about the tariff-free deal, especially for our barley producers. But the transition period is going to be very challenging for arable businesses, and I know we're going to look at that in a bit. And interesting, Bradley, you mentioned the word net margin, and I think for the majority of farmers, certainly my generation, through college and everything, we've all been taught and had drummed into our heads gross margin, sales, less seeds, ferts and sprays. With you talking about net margins, that's a different term, and we could perhaps have time in a bit to look at that. And of course, collaboration and how that can work in the sort of new world we're heading towards. So can I remind everyone to keep submitting questions? We've had some already, but keep them coming in. And the next suite of videos that we're going to have, we'll have a look at the sugar beet sector. Then we've got one of our environmentalists looking at the environmental schemes available and touching on those that are coming, which I think we've all got to admit are going to be more important than ever before. And then we've got somebody who's going to try and demystify the whole sort of world of carbon and carbon industry and how it is a potential opportunity for us as an industry. So could we continue with the next suite of videos, please?
Like much of their European counterparts, UK beet growers have had a pretty terrible year in 2020. The lack of neonicotinoid seed treatment and an unseasonably warm winter allowed the crop to become a breeding ground for aphids. These aphids then spread the virus yellow disease across the country, making the beet crop weak and unable to fulfil its potential. If that wasn't enough, these weakened plants then suffered considerable attack by the fungus Cercospora leaf spot late on in the season, effectively wiping out any potential for late season growth. Many growers harvested less than 50% of their 5-year average yield, and with small roots and relatively wet harvesting conditions leading to above average dirt tears, the aim of £2,000 per hectare gross output was a long and distant memory. So with crop sales not even covering the cost to grow, let alone any contribution to the bottom line, growers have had to rely on the profitability of other crops to foot this bill this year. For some, that was the nail in the coffin. Tight margins, rotational impact, and vastly increased risk has led them to dropping beet altogether. For others invested in the crop or in longer term contracts with British Sugar, the news that DEFRA has granted a derogation for the use of neonic seed treatment, albeit at a 75% rate, will be of some comfort. Others, who suffered less badly this year, feel that beet still contributes to the bottom line and will continue to grow regardless. The decision this year has been complicated further. Average temperatures so far in January and February have been close to the 3.5 degree trigger for the neonic derogation. But with temperatures that low, will the aphid population even have the same impact? Growers then face another choice: accept the non-treated seed with guaranteed delivery dates, or wait for the final temperatures in February to see if the derogation criteria are met and their crop to be protected, but with delivery delays. So, 12 months to forget for UK sugar beet. But the future does appear brighter. Plant breeders are suggesting that with the development of gene editing technology, effectively pressing the fast forward button on traditional plant breeding, they will be able to breed a virus yellow resistant variety, much like we saw for the rhizomania and beet cyst nematode attacks of the last 2 decades. Whether this will come quickly enough for British Sugar to continue hitting the target of 110,000 hectares per year, we will have to wait and see. Farmers should carefully assess winter temperatures, drilling dates, and the efficacy of the seed treatment if allowed. Aphid counts will be critical, and the timely application of insecticides will still be vital. Sugar beet can be a good rotational break and a strong contributor to profitability, as long as the crop and its impact is considered in the round. Brexit date has come and gone, and the UK sugar industry remains relatively unaffected. The UK is a net importer of sugar to the tune of about 35%. British Sugar have been asking the government to allow them to operate under a trade policy which supports the maintenance of a thriving and competitive sugar market. Not one engineered by handouts, but one which recognises the high levels of distortion in the world sugar market, be it through low interest rate loans in Brazil or government-owned mills in Indonesia, for instance. To trade in a level playing field will allow the most efficient sugar producers and processors to thrive. Quite how this flows down to the price paid for sugar beet, we'll have to wait and see. On farm, we will continue to make decisions based on the 1 to 3 year deals offered by our processor. Having said that, in 2021, we'll see the first trials of a futures-linked price offering, whereby growers can request to price a percentage of their beet on a day of their choosing when the futures-linked pricing mechanism is favourable. Prices available for farmers to fix in the beta trial this year have ranged from £18.50 to £23.50 per tonne. This compares to prices between £20 and £22 a tonne for standard contracts. So, despite the negative 2020 crop, there is plenty to consider when it comes to growing beet, and we hope the recent cold weather keeps the aphids at bay to allow the 2021 crop to thrive. The key messages can be broken down into short and long term. In the next quarter, it will be key to establish the crop in the best conditions possible. getting it to grow away from disease, and keep an eye on the aphid population, even if the neonic treatment is used. Looking further ahead, there will be different opportunities when it comes to pricing, and we should all back the science-led development of gene editing, which will allow us to grow beet successfully without the need for the insecticides, which cause so much angst. Thanks.
Good afternoon, my name is Lottie Hill. I'm an environmental consultant from the Norwich office, working in the ABC division, and I'm going to give you a brief environmental update. Public money for public goods is a phrase that has been bandied about a lot. What that exactly means in the funding that's available at the moment is environmental stewardship schemes through countryside stewardship. Currently available this year are wildlife offers, mid-tier schemes, higher tier schemes, CS capital grants, and for woodland there's woodland creation schemes and maintenance going on. The stewardship window for 2021 opened on the 9th of February this year. There are some things that are new, and I just want to point out a couple of them before we go through the important dates. This year, school visits, which was previously a higher tier option, has moved to mid-tier, and that pays £290 per school visit. The government are really trying to encourage more of the general public to get on farms, and this is reflected here. There's the new CS capital grants, which provides up to £60,000 worth of funding for capital items under kind of three categories: hedgerows, trees and boundaries, water quality and air quality. This year, if you're in a HLS, you can now access this funding. So previously you'd have to enter into a new CSS to get this, but you can do it in a higher level stewardship scheme. Some of the new air quality options that have been released are automatic slurry scrapers, which pays £2,760 per passageway, and low ammonia emission flooring. There's also opportunities for building tree shelters around areas, particularly for pigs and poultry sites. So the headline dates for this year's application window. The new CSS capital grants application is quite early this year, and this replaces the hedgerows and boundaries grant. Any of the capital items that need catchment sensitive farming officer approval must be sought by the 19th of March, and the application deadline is the 30th of April. The 30th of April was also the same deadline for the higher tier scheme this year. Application packs must be requested by the 31st of March, and catchment sensitive farming officer approval also needs to be sought by the 19th of March. Higher tier stewardship are the sites that have real priority habitats or species, triple SIs, sites of special scientific interest, and scheduled monuments. If you don't have any of those, you might be more suitable for a mid-tier or a wildlife offer scheme. The deadline for these schemes are the 30th of July this year, with application packs needing to be requested online by the 30th of June or via email on paper, especially for those that are wanting to split the SBI, maybe two farms and two separate applications. That's the 28th of May. Catchment sensitive farming officer approval needs to be sought 6 weeks prior to the deadline, so that will be the 18th of June this year. If you've got any options that you want in mid-tier that need Rural Payments Agency approval, they need to be contacted by the 30th of May. Now, some of the stewardship options can really help fit into the arable rotation. This graph shows the net profit over a 5-year period of some of the more common arable crops and stewardship options. I want you to focus on particularly the nectar mix and cultivated areas that provide a very high and reliable net income compared to, say, the barley or the oilseed rape. I would suggest that people start thinking using stewardship options as part of their crop rotation, allowing them to have a guaranteed income each year. Other options of interest could be, if you've got historic farm buildings, you can get paid £3.25 per square metre. Overwinter stubble, which pays £84 a hectare, and cover crops, which pays £114 a hectare. There are a variety of different options that can suit your farm. Capital options are ones that can really help future-proof the farm. Here we have some examples of previous grant funding that we've received. For planting new hedgerows, you can get £11.60 per metre. Concrete yard renewal pays £17.14. Livestock troughs pay £110 per trough, and associated pipework is about £2.50, and stock fencing is paying £4.90. We've applied for lots of different capital items, and they tend to cover about 70% of the cost. Now, looking forward, obviously we've had Brexit and the agricultural transition period, and this is going to affect the way that environmental schemes run slightly. So from now on, schemes are under UK legislation, the ones that started from 2021 onwards. This means that any inspections take place, you no longer have a penalty applied on top of the recovery. What this means is if, say, you were short of wild birdseed mix, previously you'd have to pay back the area that you overclaimed, and a penalty is also then applied on top. Now you only have to pay back the area that was overclaimed. There's going to be more focus on the environmental aims of the options as opposed to prescription based. The last application window for countryside stewardship is going to be 2023, so with agreement starting in 2024, and 1-year extensions are still being offered. So that's for HLS, higher tier and mid-tier schemes, with the idea of rolling them over until the environmental land management scheme starts. So ELMS, or Environmental Land Management Scheme, they're meant to have pilots starting in 2021 with up to 5,500 participants. The scheme's meant to be up and running by autumn 2024. Your government have guaranteed that anyone in a CSS can leave their scheme early with no penalty to join ELMS if it's more financially advantageous for them. The idea is that each landowner is going to have to create a land management plan which will try and meet the objectives of the new agricultural bill. There are 3 tiers in ELMS. The first is the Sustainable Farm Incentive, which is looking at making more sustainable farming practices on farming within forestry. The second is the Local Nature Recovery, which is focusing on priority habitats, priority species and localised targets in that area. And the third is Landscape Recovery, which is potential habitat creation and large projects such as rewilding. Looking forward, there's some take-home messages that I would recommend. Prepare for the future, work out your BPS reduction and look at how countryside stewardship can provide an opportunity to bridge the gap in funding. Use capital grants and consider using countryside stewardship as part of your rotation, and engage early this year. As previously mentioned, catchment sensitive farming officer approval needs to be sought 6 weeks prior to the application deadline. It's important to get talking to someone now so we can work out exactly what's needed and get all the consents and permissions in time. Thank you for watching.
Carbon has emerged in the past 18 months as a talking point and opportunity for many farmers. There are a number of areas within carbon. So firstly, if we think about emissions, and these are really captured by the range of footprinting tools that are available for farmers to use. These aim to try and capture emissions from fossil fuel usage, so diesel, from tillage techniques, from fertilizer usage, or from livestock. And the idea here is to understand where the current baseline is so that plans can be put in place to reduce those emissions going forward. They tend not to be so strong on capturing and understanding the sequestration on farms. So this is how new carbon can be captured and sequestered either in soil or in woodland. So let's look at those 2 areas now, and that's really looking at woodland and soils as a means for landowners to capture carbon. So woodland has emerged and is running with some pace, I have to say, and we're working with many tens of landowners in this area. These landowners tend to be those who are looking to establish either small areas of woodland for operational ease, or it might be to improve amenity, shoot, or tourism on a farm. Or we have others who are we're bringing into some larger projects we've got where woodland can actually displace root crops on farm because the income potential is very high. In both cases, there's a process that involves working with the Woodland Carbon Code, which is a framework that sets out how woodland should be planted, how it should be managed, and produces a calculation of how many tons of carbon that woodland will capture. There's a carbon guarantee, which is a government auction that allows a guaranteed base price to be secured for carbon captured, and then there are grant mechanisms that allow for the cost of trees, establishment, and the protection to be paid for. So there's a suite of different administrative and grant processes that come together, which all help to support landowners in establishing new woodland. They generally take about 12 months. So from the starting a process, it's usually 12 months before any tree is put in the ground. They are quite cumbersome from an administrative perspective, but we have a very strong track record and success rate in working with these, and actually have been the largest project developer working with the Forestry Commission over the last 12 months. So alongside woodland, there is the emerging soil carbon market. It's more complex because soil carbon is harder to measure, it's easier to lose carbon from soils, and there isn't an agreed standard that everybody's working to as there is with the woodland carbon. But it is changing, and we do expect in the next 12 months there to be some schemes available and landowners signing up to those that will allow this new market to start to develop. We are looking to work with landowners on this right now, and we're looking to understand how income from soil carbon can be part of a portfolio of income on farm. The income from soil carbon is not going to be as high, we don't think, as it will be from woodland carbon, but there is a potential for gaining over a much wider area. So it's an exciting and interesting space where I think in the next 12 months, as I say, we will see some movement. So across these carbon areas, we have a considerable amount of experience and a really strong track record working with landowners and working with those bodies such as the Forestry Commission who have been driving these initiatives forward. We see it as part of a whole farm approach that aims to assess and identify which land areas are most appropriate for which land use. This, I think, is going to result in land use change for some, but it allows new income streams to be built that weren't around a number of years ago. And we see that as preparing farms for the future and building resilience. So please do come and talk to us. We're very happy to have an initial conversation to work through some of the vagaries and complexities of these schemes, and do hope that we can help as many landowners as we can in these exciting new areas as we move forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tim, Lottie, and Greg, for that. So again, just an interesting sort of few points out of each of those speakers. Tim with the root crops, another challenging year for a crop, 50% normal yields. We know there's talk of some growers stopping to grow beet. You know, the effect of legislation, you know, with a pesticide being banned, and okay, some positive news that it may well have limited use, and then new technology coming in, gene editing perhaps as a way forward, but we ain't going to get it next year. Lottie, the public money for public good, we've heard that several times, but it is interesting to hear that capital grants now up to £60,000 per holding if you're in the right area. All those deadlines slightly sort of worries me. So I think if people want to know more about those, I think the first one's the 19th of March. We need to sort of get in touch. Elms, we're looking forward to hearing about the pilot schemes and looking forward to hearing more about it, but not going to come online until 2024, and we've got this gap between then and now. And then, you know, countryside stewardship, there are now options that perhaps on a field scale should be looked at, especially where we've got sort of crop challenges such as oilseed rape. So interesting, and very good news about penalties at last, because that was always a sting in the tail where the penalty was almost worse than the error. Greg, it's a bit clearer now, thank you. So we've got emissions, then we've got sequestration, which is divided into soil and woodland. And under woodland, we've got those carbon guarantee scheme where the government is underwriting a payment. So that is interesting. And where we've done some of those, it does give a competitive return on marginal land. So, unless you're looking at it for, for a shoot or some aesthetics, we have had a look at the number of farms where we've got fairly poor grassland, where we're getting £40 an acre, grazing license, and we're looking at potentially £100 an acre for trees. So there's an opportunity there. And very excited to hear about what's going to come online eventually for soils and their value. Okay, so before we sort of get stuck into the questions, and thank you, we have got a good selection of questions, but do keep them coming, and I'm going to try group because there's several that are on the same topic. I just want to spend sort of a minute looking at a sort of model farm worked example that we've got called Brown's Farm. Several years ago, we devised this model farm to run different scenarios through, crop price change, different croppings. Yes, of course, when sort of stewardship changed and came along, and it's been very useful. So 420 hectare farm, so basically your 1,000 acre farm. Unlike some of our competitors, our farm does have borrowing, and it also has an element of rented land. I'm not going to go through all of the details because I just want to focus on the transition period. So this is primarily an arable farm, obviously. Next slide, please. And what we've got on the screen is the profit and loss of the business, the budget for the coming year, 2021, so 1st of April 2021 to 2022, so 21 harvest. Two figures I'd like you to focus on. The first one, middle of the page, where it says add other operating incomes, rent, miscellaneous, and basic payment, 84,862. And then the bottom of the page, profit and loss before drawings, 19,256. So this is our projected budget for our example farm. What I'm now going to do is ask for the next slide, which shows the potential effect of the reducing BPS during the transition period. And just to remind you, we know what it's going to be 2021 to 2024. We're uncertain of what happens after that. There's all sorts of things coming down the line, whether it's delinking or the ability to withdraw sort of lump sums. But this is looking at our example farm with all other factors remaining equal. So under the 2021 column, you'll see the various reduction rates at the different percentages. But the 84,862 is there in the middle. And again, the profit and loss, 19,256. But what we can quite clearly see, come 2023, we're already slipping into a loss situation. 2024, when on average payments get to about 50%, and then obviously going all the way down 2027 and beyond. So the fact is, with the majority of arable businesses, the loss of the BPS without any other action will force those businesses into a loss-making situation. And that is fair for the majority of primarily sort of arable businesses. Our challenge as business managers, owners, and advisors is during this transition period to find ways to mitigate that. And we'll hear more in a bit by the questions, but I suspect, relating back to what Phil said right at the start, it's probably not going to be one thing. It's going to be a combination. And we either need to make more money at the top, or we need to reduce costs further down to maintain that profit level or possibly improve it. Okay, next slide, please. So what I'd like to do is just remind all of you about the panel. We've got Charles Whittaker, is our managing partner and an agriculturalist at heart. Rob Hughes, a partner from our Kingsland office, is a specialist in dairy livestock, but also deals with root crops and arables, being based in Kings Lynn. And Phil Dunn from our Brig office deals with a lot of potato businesses as well as primarily arable. So could I ask the panel please to switch on their cameras? And hello, Charles, hello, Phil, hello, Rob. So I'm going to try and...
Hi.
I'm going to try and field sort of various questions to the right person, but if one of you feels desperate to sort of raise a point, please do wave as well with that. So first question, Phil, sort of comes straight to you, and I think this is all to do with sort of boards and the AHDB. So a question, do you think the potato sector will be better off with or without the AHDB?
Question to start the ball rolling. Thank you,
Yes.
Steve Ward. I think we ought to be looking at reform rather than removal, and also looking more closely at what our representative board should deliver for the sector. We need something. Well, we've still got a significant number of producers to deliver that marketing gain, that generic crop promotion to help the sector. The dilemma, I guess, is that what is that body there for? Is it to push the top performers further up, or is it to drag the lower end performers up to the average? I would always favour the former, because that's the way the sector would develop and improve. We're obviously eagerly awaiting the various votes on the various sectors within the AHDB, but to have a representative body across the whole business, the whole sector, if it delivers what it should, I think you'd be a very brave business to say you can go it alone, because you are still multiple producers into less numbers of markets. Hopefully that answers it.
Thank you, Phil. Good. Okay. Next question, quite interestingly, by someone who calls himself Young Farmer, so presumably you're a young farmer. Rob, I might put this one to you, and again, it's sort of it's quite upfront. Has BPS restricted productivity of UK agriculture and access to land by young people?
So I suppose we're asking there, do we think BPS has been a force for good or evil, isn't it? If we're going to look at succession and business continuity or new people joining, I kind of think that BPS isn't really the culprit, that there are some quite substantial different structural issues associated with the industry that preclude youngsters coming in. I suppose maybe BPS has ended up in a place that meant that the farm business tenancy, which was designed ostensibly to help young entrants or new entrants, maybe the BPS has put a higher barrier to entry there. But I think in the round that there are more factors, whether it's capital taxes that stop people retiring, or emotion is a huge driver to bar on succession, isn't it? There's all sorts of reasons why youngsters can't enter. But yeah, I suppose BPS has been capitalised in some way, either through land value or rents, which haven't helped. But you can get your hands on BPS, you can buy entitlements, it's tradable. So I don't think it's been that big a block. I think the blocks have been other working capital requirements, really.
Can I come in on that, Paul? Just have a discussion. Yeah, it's a reasonable question. I think we probably have to admit that BPS probably has stifled the progress of development in agriculture. By which I mean productivity, etc. I think there's lots and lots of evidence that probably suggests that's the case. Much as we've enjoyed it in the industry and it's been a useful addition to the bottom line, but it probably, if we're honest, it probably has stifled progression, I guess, of one sort or another. I think the other thing, just to come back on that, if it's really from a sort of, is it a bar to new entrants? I think, maybe we'll get into discussion later, slightly controversial. There's another question I see up there about rents, but I think we're going to see, I personally believe we're going to see a complete reversal in terms of having had the last, well, certainly through my 30-year career, a constant sort of race for land, which is, it's come in various different ways, hasn't it? It's pushed rents up, it's pushed values up for all sorts of reasons, as Rob alluded to. But there's been a shortage of supply and a big demand from folks wanting to expand, to spread costs or make more money or just have the field next door or whatever it might be, or reinvest rollover proceeds. But whatever that rationale, I think we're going to go through a period of real radical change in the industry. I won't be too negative about it, but I think some fairly serious difficulties and rapid change, which I think is going to increase the supply actually for some land maybe that's slightly more challenging because of ability to make net margin or not, type of cropping you can grow on it, where it is, who's next door. And maybe we're going to see a complete reversal. In fact, I think we will, where quite a lot more land offered than we've got ready takers for, as we start to understand the real impact of loss of BPS altogether and focusing on net margin. What are we actually making from farming the extra 500 acres next door, or 1,000 acres down the road, or whatever it might be? And I think we're probably largely in agreement on this panel on that point. It's a question of how fast that happens, and what the impact's going to be, and who are the people that are going to still take it up, and at what value. And the point about commandable crop rents. I mean, it's hard to see why commandable crop rents wouldn't reflect the loss in BPS revenue, frankly, over a period of time. Okay, if wheat stays at 200 quid a tonne and we have normal harvest, then obviously that's all gone, that theory. But if the wheat market calms down and gets to a more normal level of 130, 140 pounds a tonne, it's difficult to see why we wouldn't see rents suffering from the loss in BPS. I don't know what the others would think about that.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I think that the flip side of the question about has BPS been a bar to entry, do we think then that its removal will be an incentive to entry? And at the moment, as we sit here at the beginning of 2021 on a grey February afternoon, March even afternoon, it doesn't feel like the reforms as tabled, albeit very incomplete in terms of our knowledge of what they're going to be, are going to be hugely attractive to new entrants to the industry. For the reasons Charles says, really, if we can't make net margins, and people cease to farm land in a conventional way, and by that I mean in the sort of post-war common agricultural policy way, why is a new entrant going to be attracted to that proposition? That's quite a conundrum as we sit here at the moment. That may become a lot more clear as the weeks and months roll by. And it won't all be doom and gloom, will it? Because for everybody who stops, somebody else tends to start or grow. So there'll be lots of opportunities without any question, because different people will see opportunities where others can't. So let's not get down in the mouth about it. But I'm just not sure that the new entrant, who is going to need to be well capitalised always, is going to want to come into an environment where opportunities are being offered where others can't readily make a net margin. It's quite a difficult one to reconcile, I think.
Hey, can I come in there, Paul?
Yes, please.
I think the BPS situation, it's the next evolution, isn't it? It's going back in time. At the beginning of subsidies were paid for production. We ended up with mountains of wheat and lakes of wine, etc. We then moved away from that production-based subsidy to an area-based subsidy, which, don't get me wrong, we need subsidies to bridge the gap between the costs and the value that we can put in the supply chain. But BPS really hasn't done us a lot of favours, has it? Because we actually get it, whether we're good, bad or ugly. We actually get it whether you sit in bed. Actually don't have to do anything to get it. And I think it's stifled the technological advancement within our certain sectors of ag. So going back to the history, this is the next phase. We're moving away from an area-based subsidy in a transition period of which we have the first 4 years where they have guaranteed about 3.2, 3.4 billion into the sector. So the subsidy to start with is just going to get distributed in different ways. My bigger fear is past this parliamentary term, 2024, there is no guarantee of any subsidy, whichever government we get. That is a bigger issue. But thankfully, we have got this transition period to think about it. So in summary, yeah, we need subsidy. And this is just going to initially be a new way of distributing it, which I don't think is a problem. I do see there being a polar movement towards environment and productivity with different land qualities and different types. There will be certain situations where environmental activities are more favoured and others where highly productive soils will probably battle it on and try to perform without subsidy. But it's just the next phase in the subsidies. It's going to be tough, it's going to mean change, but I think it's a challenge.
Yeah, agreed, thank you. Just next question that I've got from George. I know what a gross margin is, but what is a net margin? So Charles, are you okay to pick that one up, please? We're all using these terms.
Yeah, I was dying to jump into Alistair Beale's question, but I'll leave that for a bit later, Alistair. Yeah, what's a net margin? Well, I suppose we can make it what we want it to be, can't we? But I think, as Paul said, and and Phil said, we've been talking about this for a few years now, in terms of gross margins being the name of the game for the last 30, 40 years that I can remember. Output minus direct costs, and okay, what's a direct cost, what's not? But largely, I suppose what we're talking about is the operating costs, which are now at least the level of direct costs, variable costs on most combinable crop farms, I would say, unfortunately. And so labour and machinery principally is the operating cost. So assuming you could put rent in there if you wanted to as well, and finance, but leaving the land aside. So what return do we make from growing a particular crop in a rotation to that bottom line is what we're increasingly sort of calculating and working out as a net margin contribution. So, gross output, £1,000 a hectare, it might be £450, £500 for seed spurts and sprays, and typically another £450, £500 for OPEX, operating costs, all labour and machinery costs associated with doing something, as opposed to, as Phil said, not doing anything, sitting in bed or putting an environmental option in place that doesn't require the same amount of input. And I think one of the things that, as an industry, we've got to focus on with much more rigour, I think, and fast, is how do we reduce our operating costs, because they're simply uneconomic on many arable operations, unfortunately, and that's not helped by big hits on output we just had last year, but they're too high. And one or two things that Bradley was mentioning about collaboration, etc. A lot of that discussion going on at the moment. Can we share machines? And Rob might want to come in on that. Share machines, all machines, some of the machines, some of the operations. So how do we get a real focus on these operating costs? So we're really looking hard to drive them out of the business.
Yeah. Rob, sort of a question that comes up quite often about machinery sharing, what Charles has alluded to. Sort of, what's the ideal number for sharing machinery?
Oh, what a horrible question. Can we move on? I think I don't think there's such a thing, but what we've got is quite a significant reservoir of experience now that says people who are sharing. And it doesn't matter particularly whether it's a skilled operator, a skilled manager, or a piece of machinery, but people who are collaborating and making 2 and 2 into 5 from a point of view of the efficiencies of what they're doing, the value added of what they're doing, are starting to move quite a long way ahead in terms of their operational cost management and their management drive. And we're seeing that quite a lot now, and it's pretty refreshing. It needs a lot of focus. So the answer isn't numbers, Paul, the answer is people. And the guys who are doing it really well are the best managers. And they get it completely, and they're very focused on it, and very controlled about what they're doing and what they're not doing. And it works. it does work, and collaboration seems to be a route, one of the significant routes to the future, I think. But some of that is intellectual collaboration. It's not just about sharing machinery; it's sharing knowledge, and it's driving best practice.
And also, presumably, by going down that route, it helps you identify net margins because it forces you to look at the costs, as Charles said, those sort of were called fixed costs or whatever. So it makes you do that. So it makes it a lot more tangible. Okay.
Just going back on that, Paul, sorry, to butt in. That we did, I know on the BPS sort of attrition calculator, I think that was up on your slide earlier. We've got there's a web page for that, isn't there? I can't just remember the name of it. Maybe we'll send it out on the video link for this, which has got a net margin sort of a very simplified calculator on it, hasn't it? Where you can put your total fuel, total depreciation, total repairs, total labour bill, casual labour bill, PAY, etc., in a number of boxes, and then spread it around your cropping mix basically, and use the word loosely, play around with that allocation, because that's what we've all got to do. Play around with the allocation of those costs by crop until it's all gone, as it were, and you use it all up, and that then gives you your net margin to answer the question. Really, I think that's quite an important sort of discipline for us all, really, when we're doing budgets or looking at next season's plans or want to change a tractor, or as Rob says, discuss with others about sharing key bits of kit, because operating costs, I don't want to offend anybody, but I think they have been out of control in the last 4, 5, 6 years, and they've doubled across the industry without doubt, just like machine values have doubled. And depreciation is now a very big number, and is where our key focus has got to be. I think if we're making big changes around, should we put stewardship in instead of a break crop, should we do something across a significant part of our rotation, how can we reduce operating costs when making that change?
And by knowing net margins, then we can do a proper like-for-like comparison with some of the stewardship options. We can actually really sort of, compare them, I suppose. So yeah, okay. I mean, just on stewardship, just a reminder, something that we've started. So Brown&Co, we're going to have a countryside stewardship drop-in session. I think it's sort of every Wednesday, for if people want to sort of ask questions about it. So, by all means, keep an eye on social media. We're going to sort of publicise that, but you'll have access to one of our advisors about some sort of specific questions. Okay. Charles, are you ready for the next question from Alistair? And then I've got a group of questions around sort of finance as well and budgets.
Yeah, no problem. I think that drop-in session is actually a Thursday, not a Wednesday. But we'll send it out on the participants list of this, perhaps. So, Alistair, yeah, I don't think we've ever advocated that we should put a haircut on the big BPS claimants. I think we just thought that's something that DEFRA had released as something they were talking about, and that started this sort of modulation and capping yonks ago. But as you rightly say, the big claimants are the ones that are getting a much bigger haircut early on in this 21 to 24 transition period, and it's pretty painful, as you allude to there in your question. And I think there's no sort of quick fix answer other than, I suppose, what we've been talking about, this whole point about looking at net margins, and net margins particularly around where we may be in a contract farming scenario, and so we've got a tap that we can turn off, as it were, about operating costs to produce a crop. So is that net margin after operating costs producing anything at all, or would stewardship on a fairly big scale be an alternative in a particular position on the rotation or particular land type on the holding? And I think what I would say there, and it's slightly scary for all of us, and spent the last 20, 30 years trying to build up production agriculture, looking to go large on mid-tier stewardship to safeguard that support level, if you like, for the business, providing it's a net margin improvement. Over the next transition period until we see what Elms looks like and how much money we're actually going to get in Elms, which frankly we haven't got a clue about at the moment. We might speculate about it, but we don't know. But I think using mid-tier heavily as a bridge and get hold of some of that income back again and allow oneself to look hard at operating costs as well, that's chunks of numbers of tractors or other resources, I think is one of the answers, basically.
Thank you. And just to confirm, Charles, you were right. Those stewardship drop-in sessions are going to run for March from the 11th of March, every Thursday, 12 o'clock to 2 o'clock and 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock in the evening. So please do sort of use that. Next,
Paul, is it appropriate if I just pick up on a point there that of Alistair's, and then Stephen as well has asked about whether Elms is going to cover off the BPS reduction, and we don't know, as Charles says, but we're pretty certain that it won't, and that those people who are already in an aggressive stewardship scheme, you're not going to get any more probably under Elm. That the BPS loss is a real loss, and that's what we've got to, at the moment, that's where we're thinking we've got to get our heads around. If you're not in stewardship, then there is some mitigation to the BPS loss by coming in if it works for you, but the BPS loss is pretty significant, and we've got to be pretty prepared for that, because it's quite hard to mitigate that just on straight income alone.
Yeah, good point. Okay. Phil, there's a couple here about finance. I'm going to point them towards you. I think it's generally to do with serviceability and the sort of change we've seen in the mood music with banks. So the first one is, I've done cash flows for years. Suddenly the bank is asking me for a full budget. Why is that? Then the second one is, I want to extend my overdraft by £50,000 because of the poor harvest last year. I own 800 acres, so I've got a very strong balance sheet, but the bank is asking for a full budget and cash flow. Why? Only 50,000 versus 8 million balance sheet, question mark.
Okay, no problem. So the first one there, looking at cash flows, sure, we could be very creative with cash flows. We can sell 2 crop years in 1 year and make the cash position look really good. So I think the bank is quite rightly looking more towards a budget where we account for closing valuation. The banks are also, and this leads on to the second part of the question, I think probably 10 or 15 years ago, we'd never heard the phrase EBITDA from a bank manager in agriculture, but that ability to create earnings and then the ratio of those earnings being created to service our debt levels, so the capital and interest repayments. So that ratio of debt servicing cost to EBITDA within a business is now a vital and critical component of gaining finance. So leading on to the third part of that question, asset is one element, security over debt is one element, but more and more important is the serviceability of that debt in addition to the security of the debt. No bank wants to call the security in. It's not good for the image. It's not good for anybody. So looking at serviceability is now one of the key criteria. And quite often they won't just look at the interest rate levels that are being charged, say 3.5%. They'll proof that through to 7%. So if things don't go so well, have we still got enough money coming in? And that level of debt cover, so the debt servicing cost to EBITDA, they're looking at 115, so 115% cover of earnings created to debt servicing costs, up to some of the higher risk sectors at 150, 170 even. And that's not unheard of in commercial worlds anyway. So I think as an industry, we've got away with it for quite a long time. My experience is, bankers are still looking at the ag sector positively. It may not seem that way with the number of questions sometimes now asked, but the underlying asset, if you're a landowner, is still relatively stable. Quite often they'll discount that asset twice, so they'll value it at 70% of its value and lend on 70% of that 70%. So in effect, you're getting £4,900 worth of borrowing capacity out of a £10,000 acre, which gives them double cover. So that security element should be fairly safe. Does that cover off those points, Paul?
I think it does. Thank you, Phil. Yeah, there is, sort of, as you say, the times change, hasn't it? So
can you just make one point on that, Paul, as a supplementary point, just on Phil's last point? I mean, I think one of the things we've been very heavily focused on a number of businesses over the last 5 or 6 years, I suppose, is while we've got interest rates which are very low indeed, using for owner-occupiers obviously, but using land and property assets to gear up debt levels to invest in income-producing streams for a business. That might be new investment in the business, provided it's going to generate income, or it might be investments off the business to diversify out. But I think using our sort of capital land base, whether it's 7,000 or 10,000 an acre, to borrow long at 3% fixed, generating income from 10 or 12%, maybe conversion of buildings, and maybe doing other things, pig fattening, poultry, all sorts of things, or also holding all together to generate income, because from the discussion we've had earlier, that income's what's under pressure in many farm businesses at the moment.
Yeah, agreed. Okay. There's a few sort of questions which probably are better directed towards our land agency colleagues. So do watch this space for further spring seminars, which are going to be done, and land agency will cover it. But I thought it might be quite fun to throw this one into the panel because we all have a view, and I bet where I'm sitting in Leicestershire will be very different to Rob, you sitting in Kings Lynn. Where do we see land values sort of going 4 to 5 years' time, bearing in mind BPS reducing, if anywhere? Go on, Phil, North Lincolnshire, land of hope.
Well, I'm not so sure how often in the past the earnings capacity of an acre has dictated the price in the market. I think certainly in the last few decades, the fiscal policy and the taxation reasons for holding land and the physical asset of land as opposed to a share certificate has driven people to that asset, and that drive to the asset has created the demand. The supply has been tight, and therefore the price has been stable or gone up until recent years, where we've seen a bit of a drop off. It is a supply and demand and taxation calculation to me. Where will it go in the future? Well, if more supply comes forward, the pressure will come. If the demand isn't increased as well, then if there's more comes to the market without a home for it, you would naturally say, if the law of economics follows through, that the price would drop. But then again, it comes to some interesting pointers. So we've seen some crazy land prices recently on what I would call very low value land from an agronomic point of view, but people already picking up on things like the Woodland Guarantee Scheme that Greg mentioned in his presentation. So I looked at one recently that had a 3-fold increase on its guide because the city fund had come in to put trees on it. You would never have thought that 2 years ago. So we're going to get special new circumstances come to the market, which could surprise us.
Yeah. Charles, do you have a comment?
Yeah, and I think as some folk know, I mean, I've been sort of depressed about land values since the sort of the comings of a new ag policy and lots of BPS, Brexit, etc. And I think it's fair to say, in general, we have seen a sliding of land values over the last couple of years. And I think what our land agency colleagues and valuers would say on their sort of upcoming video sessions, what we've seen is a massive diversity in the market from top to bottom, and that has just got a lot wider over the last 3 years in terms of who are the buyers, what sort of land is it, where is it, what's its current use value, what's its alternative use value, and what money is chasing it. Is it rollover money? Is it, as Phil's just said more recently, carbon sequestration money, which I'm sure is going to enter the market, and I'm sure is going to provide a demand driver for land. So whilst I think there is huge change coming for the industry, and it's going to be difficult, I think we shouldn't pretend otherwise, for the next 3 or 4 years. I think there are some other, really quite positive demand drivers coming, from obviously planning and development and other things, which both fuel buyers' money in rollover returns, but also they create value on land. But equally, this carbon sequestration, whether it's woodland or soil carbon, is going to have real money attached to it. I mean, as Greg alluded to, £100 an acre for simple sort of broadleaf woodland planting under the Woodland Carbon Guarantee Code, or up to 300 quid, for some more hybrid species and hardwood timber production. So, there's some interesting dynamics coming into that market already, really. So, as Phil said, it depends what it is, where it is, who it's next door to, and a number of other factors. But we're going to have some uncertainty, which is probably going to unsettle a few values But I think, looking long term, as you say, Phil, with other monetary yields from other assets, and particularly equities being low, and a flight for some money finding a hard real asset. That's been a driver for the last 20 years, and it's probably going to continue to be a driver. Plus, there are various people, including the likes of Warren Buffett and a few of the city trading houses, talking about commodity super cycle. As we move into a different era, from this year's pricing, next year's pricing. So, volatility, I suppose, and variability is the one answer, which doesn't really mean anything, but we're going to see it, I'm sure.
The only thing, Paul, that is maybe worth some consideration, but not too much deliberation, I think, is in terms of time spent doing it, is whether we ever think government policy will be joined up. Because if we think that the government's view that we need to get the elderly generation out of agriculture, which seems to be policy, retirement plans and so on and so forth, and that they want succession, they want younger people coming in, that if they end up determining that policy into action in some form of incentive or other, then that will determine behaviour as well, and that could affect capital values, couldn't it? If they really want to do that. So we need to see, don't we, in the new world of British agricultural policy, what the real direction of travel that the government want us to go in is.
Yeah.
Paul,
Good.
could I just pick up on that carbon comment from Charles there? And with reference to Greg's talk, and I see one or two questions around it. We've got to think really hard, because this could be a real opportunity for ag. Carbon capture generally, unless you're spending a lot of money on sophisticated systems, comes from land, and farmers have land. And every industrial sector is being forced to be carbon neutral by certain dates, including agriculture. So provided, and Greg alluded to this, that we can get some form of regulated assessment, and there's a firm we're working on that at the moment, whereby farmers can assess their own carbon position and hopefully manipulate themselves into a carbon negative position, so availability to sell some sequestration, then the open market is out there and will need to capture carbon. First off, most industries will try and reduce their carbon footprint, but very few will achieve that. And I think we've got a great opportunity in agriculture to meet that need through what we do on our farmland. And we have this hierarchy of intensive cropping, less intensive, arable cropping, through to grass, through to woodland, through to the top of the hill with the peat bog, in terms of levels of carbon capture. And it's a great new exciting topic, I think. We just need that little bit of regulatory, which, as Greg said, we've got in woodland now. And I think we will very quickly get it in mainstream ag. And then as an industry, I think we've got a new income for it.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, Phil. I think that is right. It's coming fast. And going back to Rob's point about policy, I mean, government is going to be looking at climate change delivery tools, isn't it? And so I think, although people haven't really suggested as such, I'd be surprised if there's not some part of ELMS that has an element of whether it's verification standard or some other, like the Woodland Carbon Guarantee Code that we have now got, and that's the only sort of regulated market that we can participate in now. But I think it'll be coming in ELMS. The question is, can we get there faster on the voluntary market with other sort of accreditation methodology, which we and a few other people are working up at the moment. So I think that's the carrot. Can we get there faster, and can we generate income from it, from everyday farming?
Yeah, the Committee on Climate Change are talking about an urgent overhaul of agriculture, aren't they? That's the sort of language which is being, well, that's the exact language which they're using, and we don't know what that means, and it will be exciting for some and less exciting for others, but it'll be quite different to what we've been used to.
Okay. Conscious we've got 5 minutes left, and there's a lot of questions, too many to go through, so I'm just going to sort of pick a couple more randomly. We will answer all of them. There's some quite technical ones, so we will reply sort of directly, and a reminder to everyone that a recording of the session will be available afterwards. Just a quick one, Charles, if I can send it to you from Tony. All the changes, carbon, environment, requirements, machinery cost, depreciation, jobs, etc. How does contract farming agreements fit into this in the future? And I expect we can't answer all of that, but is there a place for it in where we're going?
I'm sure there's a place for contract farming, but I think it's difficult, and I think it needs to adjust and recognise, again, this whole net margin debate, capability, and they're best in class. I've used that word a few times, haven't we? And are we getting as much as is possible out of that land area or that farm with a particular contract farming arrangement? And is the sort of cost spreading impact on maybe the business that's doing the contracting, is it still cost spreading, or is it just cost addition? And are they generating income, net income for them on their operating costs? Because very often that's not the case. I'm afraid over the last, well, particularly last year, it's a very challenging year. So I think, yes, contract farming will be part of the lineup, I'm quite sure, but probably not in as rigid a format, perhaps, as we've had it in the past. And if we're trying to deal with mid-tier stewardship or other things coming in instead of break crops because they make more money, the contracting agreement's got to be sufficiently flexible to cater for that, I think. And so there is a bit of new thinking required, yeah.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. Can I add to that, Paul?
Go on, Phil.
Yeah, just briefly, contract farming, we've had a basic payment scheme, whether it's been in or out, but it's been an area-based scheme, and we grow crops by area. If new funding schemes are more product and practice policy type based schemes, it's going to be less easy to allocate that payment in or out of the scheme, in or out of the agreement. It's just going to need rethinking.
Yeah, okay. So last question, I've got to ask, it's young farmers come back in. He says, I know we need to change our business, but how do I deal not only with dad, but with granddad who's still making decisions? Go on, each of you. Who's going to go first? Charles, you're on the left. Go.
Put him out to pasture.
Rob?
Yeah, that's a really tough one, isn't it? I think it's about trust, isn't it? And getting the hopefully retiring generation to understand that they can trust in themselves to retire and trust in you to take over the business in a safe fashion. I think it's very, very difficult, and those things take a lot of time and gentle perseverance. And it'll come if you're patient. But yeah, maybe moving dad first will shift grandpa.
Phil,
good luck.
Right, to start with, be positive. There are three minds around the table, but the dominant mind and the one who's making the decisions, it's a slow transition. Sometimes it's quicker, but it generally is improved by talking. And we've done quite a lot recently where we sit as almost the referee and help them get through that process. Understanding everybody's situation, point of view, objective, time in life, all those sort of things. But the business has got to progress and it's got to move forward. And if Grandad is sat there crossing his arms saying, who's nicking my basic payment? Grandson needs to come forward and say, it's going, Grandad. We're going to find a new way of getting that money back.
Yeah. Agreed. And I think perhaps, as you say, a third party, whether it be professional, call him what you want, somebody on the family board, to perhaps be part of that and be a conduit or an instigator of the discussions sometimes helps as well. Okay, good. Right, well, crikey. Thank you, everyone. That has been interesting and the time has flown. And as I said, we've still got questions which we haven't touched on, so we will respond to those. Really, in summary, 2 words, challenges and opportunities. No reason to be glum. There is a lot to look forward to. The solutions are out there. And, you're quite right, Phil, you alluded to it, what people are looking for, soil or whatever, but space, farmers have got it. And it's the one thing that this country is short of, and they ain't going to make any more of it. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending. I'd like to thank the panel for answering sort of the questions. And I'd like to remind everyone that on Thursday, there's a livestock session, which hopefully will be as entertaining, if not more. And then keep an eye on the various sort of media sources, because we're going to have a commercial session and a land agency session when we can address some more of these questions. So thank you, everybody. I hope you have a good evening, and I hope everyone goes and does something fun. So good night from Brown&Co.
Thanks, Paul. See you.